Concluding the Making of the Group by Pauline Kael. The Crew. A caricaturist, Mary McCarthy is funny at the expense of the girls. She records their pratfalls. But she does not even try to suggest what they may gain in humanity and experience, or what they may truly lose by defeat. The actresses of the group are on their way up. The crew, most of them failed actors, had had some pratfalls. They knew that they weren't going to do much, and certainly not what they had hoped to do when they were younger. Only once did I hear one say he was considering going back to acting, and nobody believed him. The crew were cool and ironic in their evaluation of the performers. They gave measured praise when it was due. The grips, carpenters, makeup men, disbursers, controllers, the little white-haired wardrobe mistress who had been in a sister act in vaudeville, were not the sort of people to be impressed by young actresses who might come on like starlets. Youth and beauty are not in short supply in the theater, and many of the stand-ins and women who worked in one job or another on the sets, preparing baked Alaska for the wedding breakfast or the hors d'oeuvres for Libby's party, were as beautiful and often livelier and more interesting. When one of the flat-chested actresses exposed more of herself than was necessary for a scene, a member of the crew gave a W.C. Fields snarl. "2 aspirin on an ironing board." There were so many short scenes that took so long to set up. If nothing really came off in the performance, there was a blank, dull feeling on the set. For, of course, it was all up to the performers. Everything else was mechanized, and though there might be mechanical failures, there was no such thing as a mechanical success. The person on the set who was talked about with unfailing respect was Boris Kaufman, the almost legendary Boris Kaufman, who was the cinematographer for the group. In the early 30s, as the cameraman for Jean Vigo's Zero for Conduct and La Talente, Kaufman had brought new poetic lyricism to the screen. Many on the crew had had long experience with him. They were known as Kazan's crew because they had first worked together with Kaufman on Elia Kazan's films, On the Waterfront, Baby Doll, Splendor in the Grass, and they had worked with him on most of Lumet's pictures. They worked quickly and respectfully. For the technicians and actors in the East, Boris Kaufman has been a godsend. He has been the cinematographer for most of the important pictures made in New York in the past decade. Without him, it is safe to say, New York would have not attracted even the few productions it had. When Kaufman came into the rehearsal hall to announce the happy news that the budget had been increased to shoot in color, several of the girls reacted with disdain. Color for them was commercial. They thought the picture would be more artistic in black and white. But Joan Hackett said it should be in brown and white to suggest a faded old photograph album. Shirley Knight topped this by the lofty, definitive information that she had seen only one film that justified the use of color, The Red Desert. In that moment, I hated those actresses for behaving just like the group. And although I'm sure that Kaufman, a modest, sensitive, quietly efficient man, would be the first to admit that on this kind of production he is a craftsman, not an artist, I think I can guess a little of how he may have felt, even when his craftsmanship was destroyed. The beautiful modulated color he worked so hard to achieve was turned into even worse than standard American movie color in the prints that reached the theaters, as simply and carelessly as turning the knob on color TV. As the cinematographer is responsible for the lighting, he is in charge of most of the work that goes on the set, which is preparation for the brief periods of shooting. While he works, and he is the hardest working person on the set, the director waits. I wondered why Lumet did not use this waiting time to work with the actors, but he seemed too impatient to get going, to get it shot. There were no rehearsals after that first 2-week period, which meant that there were no rehearsals at all for most of the cast, only the run-throughs for the camera and lights before the take. It would be difficult for people who have seen some of these pictures to believe that they were shot where they were, in spaces so small you can hardly move the camera. People think of movies being made in beautiful, luxurious studios, with the stars emerging from big dressing rooms. Even Hollywood studios don't look the way they do in movies about Hollywood. In New York, most of the group was shot in the old Fox Movietone building on West 54th Street and 10th Avenue, where the stars' dressing rooms were known as the cell block, which is what they looked like. And when things got too crowded at Movietone, there'd be a few days shooting in a building in the Fur District, where if you didn't watch your step, you might stumble over Kay's coffin. Wherever the shooting was going on, at the St. Regis or St. Mark's, in the Bowery or Connecticut or Long Island, the technicians, the carpenters, the visitors all froze during takes, as in Marienbad. And in those moments, and perhaps only in those moments, did there seem to be some magic in the movie making. For those who were interested in movie making, this was just a job until they could get a chance at the real thing. The crew wanted to do a good job, they enjoyed the work and each other, but they were indifferent to the material they were working on. They didn't respect this way of working. But they were negative, like regular army men bitching about the army, with no real alternative in mind. The real thing was a daydream, an idea of creative work somewhere, which, when it was expressed more definitively, usually turned out to be either something honest, for example, a documentary, or something experimental, for example, TV commercials and the Richard Lester kind of movie making, or something poetic, something strange. Yet if they wanted to try to do something of their own, there was equipment they could scrounge, there was no shortage of actors. Why didn't they try something in 16mm or 35 instead of griping about the crap they were working on? Except for a very few, 3 or 4 I think, who were writing or shooting on weekends, I don't think most of them had the drive. They wanted to get paid for work, and their idea of making movies was the same old megalomaniac genius racket of power, fame, big profits, etc., only they wanted it to be creative, too. Their contempt for what they were working on was intensified by the general knowledge that, despite the superficially democratic spirit on the set, pet names and lots of kisses, they couldn't even make suggestions, which Lumet took as implied criticism. As Adlai Stevenson pointed out, absolute powerlessness corrupts absolutely. Probably not even the experienced and tactful assistant director Dan Erickson felt that he could make any recommendations. Of course, there is nothing surprising in this. It is part of the paranoia of power that men at the top, who have stolen from everyone and everywhere to get there, can't accept anything that's freely offered. Could the crew have helped? On specific matters, yes. There were very few of the errors or careless stupidities or miscalculations that had to be cut out, or that, remaining, mar the film, which were not remarked on and sometimes widely commented on by the people on the set. But I think it would be a mistake to think that the director cared that much. And there was the producer, Buckman, the only person with authority to challenge Lumet's judgment, sitting by, watching, and lifting his eyes to heaven. If he didn't care enough to prevent Kay's twirling around the walls of her hospital room like a trapped animal, another terrible smile, and an effect which made the hospital room look large as a salon, or to raise hell about Kay's ludicrous purple sunset of a black eye, why should the actors, or the crew members, risk a put-down and disfavor by pointing it out, except to each other? How little the Sidneys cared about accuracy in terms of the meaning of the material may be indicated by citing a simple error which I naively and diligently tried to get corrected. In the scene between Helena and Noreen, Helena is supposed to reply to Noreen's charge that the group were the aesthetes, as distinguished from the politicals, by saying, "The whole group was for Roosevelt in the college poll, except Polk, who forgot to vote." But the actress said, "The whole class was for Roosevelt." I heard the error during the shooting, but mindful of my agreement with the director not to discuss the material with the girls, I didn't mention it to the actress, who I am sure would have consulted her script and discovered that she was making a mistake. Instead, I mentioned it as casually as possible to each of the Sidneys, and as the sound on this sequence was badly recorded and was obviously going to need looping, that is, post-synchronization, I assumed the word would be corrected. During the first screenings of the film, without the music and with some editing still to be done, I noted the error again, and this time pointed it out somewhat more forcefully to the Sidneys. Each assured me that I must be hearing it wrong. Neither apparently took the trouble to check or listen, because when the film was screened for the press, there it was again. By then, Lumet was in London working on his next film. Buckman was back on the Riviera. Thinking that someone might care about the blooper, I called around, and after 3 people involved in the production assured me that if the Sidneys had had Helena say class, that must have been what they wanted. I finally got hold of the editor, Ralph Rosenblum, who realized at once that it was an error, but he had enough other problems to worry about. In the absence of the Sidneys, he was left to argue the cuts the National Catholic Office for Motion Pictures, a new euphemism for the Legion of Decency, wanted. These negotiations are more ambivalent than is generally known, because, of course, the distributing company may benefit from the publicity that accrues to a film, if it is having Legion trouble. But at the same time, the company will certainly want the public to think that the dirty parts haven't really been altered. Frequently, scenes are put in a picture just for the purpose of mollifying the Legion by agreeing to remove them, and as a bargaining weapon to retain other crucial scenes. And ironically, the Legion sometimes passes over these deliberately flagrant scenes and insists on removing others essential to the material. On its side of the bargaining counter, the Legion traditionally demands major, even thematic changes, and then settles for small excisions, usually of semi-nude scenes. The negotiations involve horse trading, low-cutting, and general hypocrisy. On the group, the National Catholic Office objected to 8 or 9 elements and settled for 2 bits of flesh, and United Artists was able to defy anyone to discern any appreciable difference, even after 3 screenings, which nobody was likely to go to anyway. The results. Mary McCarthy has always satirized women. We all do, and men are happy to join us in it, and this is, I think, a terrible feminine weakness, our coquettish way of ridiculing ourselves, hoping perhaps that we can thus be accepted as feminine, that we will not be lumped with those imaginary gorgons who are always held up as horrible examples of competitive, castrating women. We try to protect ourselves as women by betraying other women, and of course, women who are good writers succeed in betrayal but fail to save themselves. The most condescending, most sanctimonious, the phoniest dialogue in the movie, and it's right out of the book, is uttered by dear little Polly, and is intended to show what a fine girl she is. She tells Gus Leroy that she set out to be a doctor, and he says, "Too late now?" And she says, "Well, not if I had Libby's drive, I suppose, or Kay's." Gus says, "You think you haven't?" And she answers, "Worse, in college I never cared particularly for people with drive, or those most likely to succeed." The truth is, the only way I could like assured, aggressive girls was to feel sorry for them. This dreadful nonsense, which would be called Uncle Tomism if uttered by a Negro, is very appealing to men, and, of course, men like the Sidneys rightly include the author in the category she is condemning. I don't think there is any doubt that Polly is here speaking for the author, because the structure of the book says the same thing, that the quiet girls, who don't come on strong, come off best as human beings. Although at the time she was writing the group, she may have believed in this quietism and imagined that, as the author of Venice Observed and The Stones of Florence, she had become an elegant aesthete like Lecky. It is her inability to endow Polly and Lecky with the hideous believability of the others that gives the lie to the structure of the book. It is only when Polly is asking clear questions, like earlier Mary McCarthy heroines, that she has some stature as a character. Mary McCarthy can bring Polly to life when she's seeing through Dr. Beecher, but not when she's selling blood or feeling sorry for the other girls. That comes easier to Buckman and Lumet than to Mary McCarthy. If the group had had a woman scriptwriter and director, it might have been much more satirical. But ultimately, Buckman and Lumet have betrayed women in a more basic way, by treating the girls as poor, weak creatures, as insignificant little women. For this, of course, is their way of being sympathetic, of making the movie more compassionate than the novel. They don't feel the same condescending need to soften the men's roles, so these men seem like even worse bastards than the men in the novel, now that the women are so much more sympathetic. Mary McCarthy has said, "What I really do is take real plums and put them in an imaginary cake." In the movie, they have baked a different cake using ready mix, but the plums are still there, good juicy plums of real experience, recognizably real and familiar, so that we laugh with the pleasure of recognition. In a sense, the girls and crew, in calling it a soap opera, were more instinctively accurate than the Sidneys, with their meanings and interpretations. But it isn't soap opera just because it deals with tangled lives and loves. Almost all novels do, good ones as well as bad. The quality of observation, though at times at a soap opera level, is generally much higher. Actually, the Sidneys' ideas are closer to soap operas than the material they're working with. When they think, they dish out soap opera interpretations, but what they worked with is interesting enough to make their interpretations seem silly and phony, which they are. Life, to the degree that Mary McCarthy catches it and they use her material, is not reducible to their ideas, which oddly they seem to feel are higher, more important, than giving us something of the life of a period. They really are products of the 30s, using fashionable liberal ideas to explain and falsify what they're doing, which is what Mary McCarthy was exposing in The Girls. What gives the movie its vitality, and despite its carelessness and sloppy style, it is one of the few interesting American movies of recent years, is that the talented, fresh young performers are given some material to work with. There's solid observation in Mary McCarthy's writing, and the movie is a considerably more realistic and sophisticated account of modern male-female relationships and what goes wrong in them than we've had on the screen. It deals with the specific experiences of women in our time that Mary McCarthy has always specialized in. How a girl, Dottie, may want to lose her virginity, but then feel unwanted and deserted when a casual affair doesn't turn into love. How sacred virgins may come on as the sexiest teasers, Libby. How a woman's life can be made a ridiculous martyrdom to theories of childcare, Pris. And how people use analysis in their relationships, Polly and Gus. After his part of the editing was finished, a few days before he left for England, Sidney Lumet asked me to a ritual lunch at the same restaurant where we had had our first. The United Artists executives had just seen the picture, and Sidney was chuckling in triumph. "You know," he said, "at first they were afraid I couldn't do this picture, that I wasn't a woman's director. In Hollywood, that is generally a euphemism for a fussy, effeminate director." Although Lumet has given the group something the usual woman's director wouldn't, I miss the clarity and detail a good woman's director might have given it. I have an awful feeling that in the movie, when Libby protects her virginity by kneeing Nils in the groin, and Nils says, "Did your lady teachers teach you that?" Sidney Lumet thinks they did. But if his sense of the material is a little primitive, some of its reality got to him too. "Funny thing," he said. "You remember that day you mentioned the actor Harold that Mary McCarthy was married to, dying in a hotel fire? I didn't remember until later. I knew Harold Johnsford. When I was a kid, starring on Broadway in My Heart's in the Highlands, he had a small part in it." He asked if I had gotten what I wanted from following the course of the production, and I didn't know what to answer, because I had really got more than I wanted. When you see a movie, it has a certain inevitability, but when you see a movie being made, you see how it might be, how it could be, how it should be. The worst thing about movie making is that it's like life. Nobody can go back to correct the mistakes. I think now I know the answer to one question that always comes up when people discuss what has happened to novels when they become movies, and ask, why did they leave out so-and-so? The obvious answers were, for length or unnecessary complication, because they couldn't include everything, for propriety, and to please church or pressure groups. To these I can add, because they didn't shoot it very well, and when the sets have been struck and the actors and technicians have gone on to other commitments, it's almost impossible to go back and redo it. They just hack it out. This problem of no return also explains why so many obviously bad things are in it. They were too integral to the story to be left out, so they just had to be used, no matter how bad. If an actor's reading is too awful, he may be dubbed. If performances are so disastrous that editing can't save them, the roles may be almost eliminated. They generally can't be totally eliminated, because then sequences involving large numbers of people or sequences essential to the story would have to be cut. When I asked what had happened to some particularly nice little scenes, Lumet tried out the gaudy explanation that he had learned not to be self-indulgent about retaining too many unusually good moments. But either he's too honest, or my face gave me away, because he began to laugh. When important material is cut, even crucial material, the justification is always that the movie is too long anyway. But when one persists and says why this rather than that, the plain truth generally comes out that because of negligence or some error in planning, the bit couldn't be properly made to fit. The editor takes the pieces for a jigsaw puzzle, and if they don't quite fit, forces them into place. We're supposed to ignore little holes as unimportant, as even more modern and jazzy. If a director is more concerned to get something on film than to get it right, the editing is going to be very tricky. The beginning of this movie is too fast and confusing for the simple reason that the big scenes of the graduation and Kay's announcement of her engagement to Harold were a shambles and were chopped to fragments. When asked how the audience would get its bearings, how they would be able to tell who the girls were and what was going on, Lumet said it didn't matter. The problem of the time transitions and how to link the episodes so that the audience might get some sense of the girls' lives didn't matter either. The material flying by so fast may even help Lumet's reputation as an artistic director. This, more and more, is the way movies are going to be made, because it is more businesslike. Lumet has had the genius to be a pioneer. He doesn't think the little things matter. Economy represents the decisive factor in the working arrangements. Yet because of these working arrangements, there is one large area of waste. After watching a few weeks of shooting, I sat down with the script and calculated I could save close to $250,000 in production costs just by cutting out before it was shot what I assumed would have to be cut out after it was shot. The group, like most movies these days, begins with a script for an unconscionably long movie. Over 3 hours, many 4-hour movies are shot. I gradually came to see that, given the working methods, they needed this extra footage because they were never sure of what would work out and what wouldn't. My calculations were posited on a coherent storyline and the retention of the best material. The actual final cut removed much that I would have cut, but also a great deal that I considered essential. And I realized that they had shot an over 3-hour script so they could pull some kind of 2.5-hour movie out of it. Economy, speed, nervousness, and desperation produce the final wasteful, semi-incoherent movies we see. Carried much further, this pioneering could mean the death of what we now still know as the art of the film. The key word in that sentence is that little shrinking we. Lumet has the right chemistry for the new kind of picture-making, and the genius to know that for the really big audience, the little things don't count. If vast audiences are indifferent to the absence of beauty on television, if they do not object to the loss of visual detail when they see old movies on television, if they do not object that the shape of the image destroys much of what remains of the compositions, if they do not object to the cuts which make the storyline and characterization incoherent, and to the interruptions for commercials which destroy the intensity, the suspense, the whole dramatic construction, then why not give them what, apparently, is all they really want, the immediacy of foreground action and as many climaxes as possible. I would not have written this lengthy analysis if I did not feel that there are basic, crucially important reasons for not making movies in this way. I discovered that my subject was not so much what happens when a book becomes a movie, but what happens when movies become television. That finishes that, and thank you for listening.